At the mine, I found something that could have saved my wife. But at the hospital, they decided to dispose of it. I came back and started talking. Look how far silence can go. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. I woke up before the sun, like always. Not because of any alarm clock, I'd long stopped trusting something that artificial, but because the silence in the house had weight to it. It wasn't just stillness. It was the kind that presses on your ribs until you open your eyes. The kind that reminds you no one else is going to make the coffee or stir in the sugar. The kind that reminds you someone you love is lying in the next room, not dead, but not quite alive in the way you remember either. The kitchen was cold, the linoleum curling at the edges like old paper. I moved around it without thinking, the way you walk through a memory. Coffee ground scooped by feel, kettle filled, burner clicked. Outside the window, the world was still gray, the street barely more than a shadow. Across the road, the windows of the Henderson house were still boarded up. No one had lived there in years, but I still caught myself looking over sometimes, like waiting for a light to turn on. While the water heated, I stirred the oats. I always made them the same way, soft, just a bit of salt. Not that Sarah could tell. She hadn't really tasted anything in years, but I still fed her like she could. That was part of the rhythm of it, doing what needed to be done even when no one knew you were doing it. The bedroom door creaked like always when I pushed it open. Sarah lay just the way I left her, pale, still. Her eyes were half open, fixed on some faraway place. Maybe a crack in the ceiling, maybe nothing at all. I bent down and kissed her forehead. Her skin was cool. I whispered her name, more out of habit than hope. There was no response, but that didn't matter. I didn't do it for the answer. I set the tray on the side table. The room smelled of disinfectant and lavender. I'd started using that scent when the home nurse stopped coming. Couldn't afford her anymore. But I tried to keep everything clean. Her sheets, her hair, the folds of her skin, everything. Because if there was one thing I still had control over, it was this room. This small corner of the world where she rested and where I still believed something of her remained. After breakfast, I cleaned her, checked her catheter, repositioned her arms. There were routines within routines. I did them not just to help her, but to keep myself moving. If I stopped, I'd fall apart. And there was no one around to put me back together. When I left for work, I did it quietly. The neighbors didn't need to see me. The town didn't care. They'd written me off as the man with the broken wife who kept digging holes in the earth. Maybe they were right, but there was nothing else for me to be. The mine sat on the edge of town like a scab no one wanted to touch. Rusted gates, warped signs, buildings that slouched with age. Some days I wondered why it was still open. Other days I knew exactly why. Because men like me would keep showing up, no matter how much it took from us. Because we needed it more than it needed us. Inside, the air changed. Thick, damp, filled with the scent of metal and decay. The kind of air that clings to your skin and sinks into your bones. I clocked in without speaking to anyone. Most of us didn't bother with pleasantries anymore. What was there to say? Down in the tunnels, everything felt closer. The walls pressed in, the ceiling seemed to breathe. I knew every inch of it, every echo, every groan. I worked with my hands and didn't look up unless I had to. Above ground was for other people. My world was down here. Sometimes I thought of Sarah while I worked. Thought about the way she used to dance in the kitchen when her favorite songs played. Thought about the freckles on her shoulders in the summer light. Thought about how much smaller she'd gotten in the hospital bed. How her fingers curled inward like dried leaves. There was a time I told myself I'd quit. That I'd find something better. Something safer. But then the bills came. The medication, the bed frame, the lift, the oxygen. And I realized there was no out. Not for people like us. That night I was assigned to a section no one wanted. Old shaft. Unstable walls. Management didn't care, just told us to be careful. But careful didn't mean much underground. I moved slowly, checking the supports, watching for signs of strain. My boots crunched over loose rock. The beam from my helmet lit up dust particles like stars. And then I saw it, something flickering against the wall, just past the normal shimmer of coal and quartz. It was embedded in the rock, halfway visible, smooth, bluish, iridescent. At first I thought it was glass, some leftover from another crew. But when I touched it, it was warm, almost pulsing, like it was alive. I worked around it, freeing it gently. It slid out into my hand like it wanted to be found. It was the size of a peach, but heavier. Inside, something shimmered, not like a reflection, more like light trapped beneath the surface. Moving, breathing. I wrapped it in the softest thing I had, a piece of old t-shirt from when Sarah and I used to camp. I didn't tell anyone, just slipped it into my bag and kept working like nothing had happened. That night I walked home differently. My back still ached, my knees still hurt, but my mind buzzed. I couldn't stop thinking about what it might be. A gem, a crystal, something rare. And what if it was worth something? Something real. Enough to get Sarah the care she deserved. Enough to stop working underground like a mole waiting for collapse. Enough to see the sky again without flinching. I didn't sleep that night. I sat beside her, holding her hand, imagining a life that felt possible again. One where she smiled, where I didn't reek of dust and sweat, where we had light. But when dawn came, it wasn't light that knocked on the door. It was a rattle in her throat, a tightness in her chest, her lips pale, eyes fluttering. I called the hospital before I even realized I'd moved. Dressed her in shaking hands, carried her to the car, the bag with the stone still over my shoulder. I didn't know it then, but by the time I got her to the ER, something had already changed. Not just in her, but in me too. Because once you see light underground, you can't pretend the dark feels the same. The hospital lights were too bright. They always were. Cold and buzzing, humming down the narrow hallway, like they had somewhere better to be. I carried Sarah through the doors, her body lighter than it used to be, but still heavy with the weight of urgency. Her head leaned against my shoulder, her breath shallow and uneven, like it was trying to remember how to be steady again. A nurse looked up as I came in, clipboard in hand. I didn't wait for her to speak. I told them her name, her history, that something was wrong, that it was worse this time. They wheeled her away on a gurney, her hand slipping from mine like it always did now, without resistance, without grasp. I stood there watching her disappear down a hallway lined with linoleum and ghost-colored curtains. They told me to wait. So I did. I found the same old bench I always did, near the vending machines with the flickering panel that never lit the right number. I sat down, bag still over my shoulder, and stared at the scuffed floor. My hands felt too large, too useless. Time passed the way it does in places where time doesn't matter. Slow, shapeless, heavy. Nurses came and went. Someone cried behind a curtain. A man coughed wetly into his sleeve. And I just sat, thinking about the stone in my bag. Only it wasn't there. I didn't notice it at first. My mind was elsewhere, on her face, her skin, the way her breathing had changed. But when I reached in for my wallet to buy a soda, my fingers brushed the shirt I'd wrapped it in. Empty, just cloth, no weight, no warmth. I checked again, tore through the pockets, the folds, the lining. Nothing. The stone was gone. I stood, heart hammering, eyes darting across the lobby. Had someone taken it while I was distracted? While I was checking Sarah in? But who would have known it was there? Who would have even cared? Before I could act, a voice called my name. I turned. A man in a white coat approached, tall, gray-haired, with the kind of confident calm that made people believe whatever he said. He introduced himself as Dr. Layton, Chief of Internal Medicine, said he'd been looking over Sarah's chart. His voice was even, smooth, practiced. He held something in his hand. My hand-stitched shirt scrap, and inside it, the stone. He smiled, said he found it in my bag while checking for medication instructions, said it caught his eye, the color, the odd glow, asked if I knew what it was. I opened my mouth, but nothing came. He chuckled softly, said it looked like some kind of quartz imitation, probably costume jewelry or melted glass. Nothing of value. Pretty, but worthless. He told me not to worry, that it was common for miners to pick up odd-looking rocks, thinking they were special. Then gently, almost kindly, he suggested he dispose of it for me. Hospital regulations, he said. We can't keep unknown materials around patients. Biohazard protocols, something about lab contamination. The words sounded official, logical. They wrapped around my confusion like a net. I hesitated. Something inside me stirred an itch of doubt, a pulse of something colder. But he wore the coat. He had the badge, the clipboard, the title. I had coal under my nails. I nodded. He thanked me, folded the cloth with practiced care, and walked away down the corridor. I sat back down. This time, I didn't open the bag. I didn't move. My hands rested on my knees like they belonged to someone else. Sarah was stable, they said. They'd given her fluids, adjusted her medications. She was resting now. I could see her. When I stepped into the room, everything slowed. Machines beeped softly in rhythm with her heart. Tubes ran from her arms to bags of clear liquid. Her skin was pale, almost translucent in the sterile light. But she was breathing. That was something. I took her hand. It was cooler than before. I sat beside her and began to read. I always brought a book, even if she didn't respond. It was an old collection of poetry we'd once loved. I picked a page at random and read quietly, the words dry and strange in my mouth. But the rhythm helped. The voice gave me purpose. For a while, I forgot about the doctor, the stone, the missing glow. I only remembered the shape of her hand, the way her eyelashes trembled when I whispered her name. Later that night, back home, I stood in the kitchen holding the empty cloth. I stared at it, willing it to feel heavier again. I replayed the doctor's words in my head, his tone, his eyes. That slight pause before he said it was worthless. I didn't sleep. Instead, I paced, back and forth between our bedroom and the hall. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter, that I was lucky Sarah had survived, that nothing else counted. But the feeling wouldn't leave, like something had been taken from me, and I hadn't even fought back. By morning, the guilt had solidified into something else, something sharper, a kind of anger I hadn't felt in years, not rage but resolve, a quiet heat that rose from somewhere deeper than exhaustion or grief. I needed to know the truth. I didn't trust the coat. I didn't trust his words. And I knew deep down that whatever that stone was, it mattered. Maybe not because of the money, maybe not because it could save me, but because it had been mine, because I had found it in the dark, where nothing else ever shone. That afternoon, I went to the only place in town where truth still lived in pages. The library sat at the edge of the square, a low brick building with dusty windows and a sun-faded flag. Inside, it was quiet in the best way, like stepping into a world where time took a breath. The air smelled of paper and old wood. It smelled like memory. Mary was at the desk. She looked up when I entered, offered a smile that didn't ask questions. She was in her 50s, maybe older, with silver in her hair, and the kind of face that made you feel like you hadn't been forgotten. I told her I needed help, that I'd found something underground, that it had been taken, but I wasn't sure by who or why. I described it as best I could, the color, the glow, the weight. She listened, really listened. She led me to a table, opened an old geology book, then another. We searched through photographs, mineral charts, strange terms. None of it matched exactly, but she made a note. She said she had a colleague, someone at a university in the city. She'd call him, ask for a second opinion. I thanked her. Not because it was polite, but because I didn't know what else to do. It had been so long since someone had believed me without hesitation. The next day she called. Her voice was shaking, but not from fear. The colleague was a geologist. Said based on the description alone, it could be a rare luminescent compound, something not yet fully classified. Experimental uses in medicine, high energy conductivity, one of a kind. Research labs would pay to study it. Museums would beg to display it. I stood there in the library lobby, phone pressed to my ear, and everything blurred for a second. Not because of greed or even relief, but because I realized the truth had a name. And I had almost let someone erase it. I hung up, sat down on the bench outside, watched cars crawl past the courthouse, and I knew what I had to do. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was tired, yes, but fear, that was gone. I was going back to the hospital. I was going to get it back, not just the stone, but the part of myself I'd given up too easily. The third morning began like the others, gray light bleeding through the curtains, the quiet hum of machines beside Sarah's bed, the smell of old coffee and liniment in the kitchen. But I didn't pour a cup this time. I didn't reach for the oatmeal or my coat. I sat at the edge of the bed for a long while holding her hand. Her fingers twitched sometimes involuntarily, and I like to imagine it was a kind of communication, that some part of her still listened when I spoke. That morning I didn't speak aloud. I let the silence carry my promise. When I walked back into the hospital, I didn't come through the emergency entrance like before. I used the front doors. I stood taller. I wore my work jacket with the coal smudges still on the sleeves, and I kept my eyes straight. I passed the same nurse at the front desk, nodded once, and kept walking. The hallway felt colder than I remembered, the light harsher. I didn't ask for directions. I remembered the door his office, the polished nameplate beside it, the brass knob. I knocked once and then opened it. Dr. Layton looked up from his desk, surprised but not startled. His face shifted quickly. Something behind his eyes flickered, then stilled. He leaned back, folded his hands, and gave me that same rehearsed smile. I told him I'd come for what he took. He frowned, feigning confusion. I told him again, slowly, firmly. The stone. The one I had with me when I brought my wife in. The one he claimed was worthless. His voice stayed calm. He said there was no such object in their records. Nothing matching that description had been cataloged or stored. He said it must have been discarded in accordance with hospital policy, biohazard protocols, sanitation, proper disposal. I told him I'd spoken to a geologist, that I knew what it was, that I had a description, a witness, even correspondence verifying its possible value and uniqueness. I told him if he didn't return it, I would go public. That's when his tone changed. Subtle, but unmistakable. He leaned forward, said he hoped I understood the seriousness of my accusation, said that possession of certain minerals from restricted industrial zones could be a criminal offense, said that if I pursued this, I might face questions from authorities about theft, about smuggling, about illegal extraction, said he would be forced to report me. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten me directly. He wrapped it all in protocol, in procedure, in that steady, condescending baritone that made it sound like he was protecting me from myself. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice either. I looked at him for a long time, looked past the coat, the papers on the desk, the framed degrees on the wall. Then I turned and walked out. But I wasn't walking away. I was turning towards something else. The mine was where I always returned when I needed to remember who I was. That afternoon, I walked onto the site during a shift change, boots heavy with resolve. The men were scattered, some still suited up, others wiping the sweat from their necks. I called a few names. They stopped what they were doing. I asked them to listen. I told them everything, not just about the stone or the doctor or the theft. I told them about Sarah, about the years, the silence, the long hours underground, the way management turned a blind eye to our injuries, to the age limits, to the slow poison we all breathed. I told them how I'd found something beautiful in the dark, and how someone tried to take it because they thought I was too small to fight back. More men gathered. I kept talking. I wasn't trying to inspire them. I was just telling the truth. And maybe they were tired of being lied to. When I finished, no one clapped. No one cheered. They just stood there, quiet, looking at one another. And then the old foreman, who hadn't spoken more than a few words to me in years, stepped forward and took off his helmet. He said we'd had enough. By nightfall, the gates were blocked. Machinery stood still. The mine was silent in a way I hadn't heard before, not because of death or fatigue, but because of decision. Word spread fast. Workers called their families. Some brought chairs. Others brought signs. A few brought their children. Someone started a fire in a barrel, and men huddled around it like they used to when the heaters broke underground. The local paper showed up the next morning, then a news van, then another. Someone passed them my name. I stood in front of a microphone with shaking hands and told the story again. This time, it wasn't just miners listening. It was the town, the state, maybe more. I showed them the emails from the geologist, the photos of the cloth. I spoke about what happens when working people are told their worth ends where their paychecks do, about how too many of us were disappearing into the dirt while someone else polished their boots on our backs. Sarah's name was mentioned. They ran her picture, an old one, from before the stroke, when her eyes were still full of mischief. I hadn't looked at that photo in years. The hospital issued a statement, said they were reviewing internal procedures. That was the phrase they used. Reviewing. Procedures. No mention of theft. No mention of me. But the pressure mounted. The miners refused to return. The footage of us outside the gates played on evening broadcasts. The story hit national outlets. I started receiving letters, emails, a few calls. Dr. Layton resigned. That was the word they used. Resigned. Quietly, without charges, without admission. A judge ordered the return of any material wrongfully obtained from my possession. Legal language. But I understood what it meant. The day they handed the stone back to me, it didn't glow. It sat cold in its wrapping, its shimmer dulled under fluorescent light. But I didn't need it to shine. I knew what it had cost, what it had become. They asked if I planned to sell it, if I had offers. I did, but I said no. Instead, I contacted the university, the same geologist. I told him I wanted the stone to be studied safely, publicly, that any proceeds or patents or profits derived from it had to go toward a fund, a real one, for miners, for their families, for medical care, re-education, disability support. He agreed. We signed papers. A reporter asked if I felt like a hero. I said no. Heroes are people who choose. I had never felt like I had a choice. I had only ever wanted to keep someone I loved from slipping further away. I returned home with the cloth folded neatly in my pocket. Sarah was still at the clinic. They'd transferred her to a better facility using donations the community raised after the story aired. I visited every day, brought books, music, stories. I told her what happened. I told her what we had done. Her eyes fluttered sometimes when I spoke. The nurses said she had more movement in her fingers. One of them swore they saw her smile. I didn't argue. I let myself believe it. The mine remained closed for a time. They said they'd conduct inspections, safety reviews. Maybe they would. Maybe not. I didn't plan on going back. I spent more time at the clinic. Learned how to help her stretch her legs, how to adjust her oxygen, how to keep her warm at night. I didn't miss the darkness. I didn't miss the dust. One afternoon, as I sat beside her window, watching a group of birds wheel through the late autumn sky, I realized something. The stone, for all its beauty, hadn't changed her condition. It hadn't cured her, hadn't undone the damage. But it had done something else. It had made the world see us. It had made them stop and look. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe that was enough. I didn't think it would be so quiet once it was over. Not just around me, but inside. After the interviews, the articles, the hospital's denial, the judge's ruling, the news trucks pulling away, I thought I'd still feel something buzzing under my skin. Rage, maybe. Triumph. Fear. But no. When I walked out of the courtroom holding the folded piece of cloth with the stone inside, I just felt still. Like I'd been underwater for too long and was finally back at the surface, just breathing. I drove to the university that same day. No reporters followed me this time. No camera crew waited at the door. I brought the stone in a padded box, the kind people use for jewelry or relics, even though it had never needed that. I held it one last time before handing it over. It looked the same as the day I found it blue, strange, gently glowing when held at certain angles. But it didn't feel like mine anymore. It belonged somewhere else now. The head of the materials science department met me personally. His handshake was firm, his voice full of gratitude. He promised transparency, full access to reports, and most importantly, full agreement to the condition I had laid out. That all financial benefit from research or development stemming from the mineral would fund the Harper Workers Relief Initiative. He said the name was strong. I told him it was Sarah's. We signed the contracts, pages upon pages. I didn't pretend to understand every word, but I made sure to understand enough. I didn't want this to become another story twisted in someone else's mouth. I didn't want to be remembered as a lucky miner or a stubborn husband. I wanted something better to come of it, something lasting. Afterward, I sat outside on a bench facing the quad. Students passed me, talking about classes and papers and music I didn't recognize. They had futures. That struck me, more than anything. They had whole lives ahead of them, and I had helped build a path narrow, maybe, but real so, that some other working man's kid could get treated when their lungs failed, or their father's back broke, or their mother's heart gave out from too many long shifts in too cold factories. That mattered. Back at the clinic, Sarah's room had changed. New curtains, softer lighting, even a small stereo with speakers mounted near the bed. The nurses played classical music in the afternoons, soft jazz in the mornings. I brought her books even though her eyes no longer focused. I read anyway. I learned how to lift her without hurting her shoulder. I learned how to notice when she was cold or in pain or tired. I stopped talking so much about what had happened and started talking about small things again. The weather, the birds outside the window, the smell of rain on the grass. She didn't answer, but she didn't need to. Her breathing was calmer now, less strained. Her hands didn't tremble as often. She moved her head sometimes toward my voice. Whether it was instinct or something more, I couldn't say. But I felt her near me again. That was enough. One evening in early spring, I walked into her room just as the sunset was pouring through the blinds, coloring everything in gold. Her hair had grown out a little, soft and silver now. I took her hand and sat beside her. The warmth of the sun touched her face. For a moment, she looked almost exactly as she did before the stroke, just older, quieter, but not gone. I thought about the stone, where it might be now, in some lab, under microscopes, in beakers and test chambers. I imagined young scientists arguing about its properties, making notes, discovering things I'd never understand. That didn't bother me. It felt right. The stone didn't belong buried in darkness. It didn't belong in my pocket. It belonged in the hands of people who could use it to light something bigger than one man's grief. Some people wrote letters after the story died down. A few sent donations to the fund. Others just said thank you. I didn't write back to most. I wasn't looking for applause. I didn't even put my name on the foundation's website. I let the work speak for itself. I thought about going back to the mine once just to see it. I drove halfway there, but turned around before reaching the gates. I didn't need to go back. That part of my life was closed. Not because I hated it, but because it had given me everything it could. I carried it with me, in my lungs, my bones, my memories. But I didn't have to carry the weight anymore. Instead, I spent my mornings at the clinic. I brought Sarah breakfast, though someone else always fed her. I trimmed her nails, brushed her hair, turned the pages of old photo albums. Some days I talked to her for hours. Other days I just sat and let the silence fill the room. One nurse, a kind woman named Denise, told me I was helping more than I knew, that people noticed, that Sarah did too. I nodded but didn't answer. I didn't want to explain to her that this wasn't about being noticed. It was about not letting go. The sun came earlier each day. Birds built nests outside the window. I brought Sarah a little wooden wind chime and hung it by the sill. When the breeze came through, it played a soft, uneven song. I imagined she could hear it. I stopped counting how many days had passed since the stone was returned. Time had become something else. Not a measure of loss, but a rhythm of care. There was a peace in that, a simplicity I hadn't felt since before she got sick. One afternoon, I found myself reading aloud a passage from a novel she used to love. I don't remember which book, just a quiet moment, a character watching the sea, wondering if the waves remembered every boat they'd ever carried. I looked at her and wondered the same. Did she remember me still? Did some part of her still drift through our old life? And then she moved her fingers. Not just a twitch in actual movement. She squeezed mine. I stopped breathing. I leaned in, called her name. Her eyelids fluttered. Her lips parted just slightly. It was brief. It could have been a reflex, but I didn't think so. I sat with her through the night, holding her hand, listening to her breath. I didn't need confirmation. I didn't call the nurse. I just stayed. In the morning, the sun rose over the clinic like it always did, but everything felt brighter. Not because of the light outside, but because of what I'd felt in her hand. That small pressure, that silent answer. I think about the stone sometimes, about how I found it, glowing in the dark, buried under rock and time. I think about how I carried it up, wrapped in cotton and hope, not knowing what it was, not knowing what it would cost me or what it would give. But in the end, it wasn't the stone that saved her. It wasn't the protests, the court rulings, the interviews. It was staying. It was not giving up when the world told me I should. It was loving someone when there was no reason left to hope. I found a light in the ground, but the real light, the one that matters, the one that changes things, that was here all along, in her, in us, in the way I still sit beside her window each day, hold her hand, and whisper stories into the quiet. Just in case she's listening, because I believe she is, and because now I know for certain. The light is stronger than the stone. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out the next video and feel free to share this one with someone who needs to hear it.